Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Finca Soledad Pepe Wash Processed Ecuador from Hydrangea Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And as you can see, Pepe did not sign my bag of this coffee. However, he did send me this Instinto shirt, so I will take that as a victory in itself. But Hydrangea, based out of Berkeley, California, and they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel on numerous occasions. However, it has been over half a year since they were last featured on this channel. And in that time, Hydrangea did make a switch from roasting on the probats to the loring. So this should be our first review since they made that transition. And it'll definitely be interesting to see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 45. And recipe we went with for this coffee was Hydrangea's recipe, which is a 15:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 93 degrees Celsius, about 199 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind roast profile for this coffee. The one and only piece of feedback that I did hear from others about this coffee was that one person experienced a slight bit of roastiness within it. That being said, I certainly didn't experience that throughout the entirety of the time that we were working with this coffee. That being said, Hydrangea is known to not necessarily be the lightest roasting coffee roaster out there. However, with the samples that I did try since they've made the transition from the probats to the loring, I can definitely say that they have started to roast a little lighter in general. And that's the best way to kind of describe this one, is that it's lighter than the coffees that they used to release when they were roasting on the probat. And one person I heard say that it's like a lighter version of some of the coffees that Bots releases, and I could say that, yeah, that's certainly the case. Bots also isn't the latest roasting coffee roaster out there, and I could even say that some of the coffees we've sampled and tried from Hydrangea have been on par with some of the ones from Say as well. So they're, I would say, on the more moderately light side of that medium light by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, first impression through the V60, and the coffee was a bit more bright and citric forward than expected, as it feels like it's a bit early to be brewing this one. Not particularly well defined, as it does have an interesting combination of an old school Say brightness and a Hydrangea sweetness, so it was an interesting start. As I kind of mentioned, it just had a lot more brightness than I probably was expecting going into it, but I think that was more an indication that this coffee wasn't really ready to be brewed yet. Day 18 through the Chemex, and there's a similar experience this time around, as it continues to feel like the best of this coffee is yet to come, as it's not particularly well defined, though it does open up as it cools down, offering a bit more of a tropical feel and a slightly clear sugar-like brightness to it as well. Day 21 through the April brewer, and the coffee is the best it had been to this point, largely due to the fact that it felt significantly more balanced, with a higher level of sweetness and better definition to the listed stone fruits, as well as a nice tropical sugary sweetness as well. Much better overall with that increased sugary quality to it, so I definitely felt that this coffee was headed in the right direction. Day 24 through the V60 with Hydrangea's recipe, and the coffee is notably improved from the earlier days, as it has a clean and sweet profile with an abundance of sugariness in line with the expectations that I did have for a Pepe Mejorado going into this coffee. Brightness has settled a bit over time. As I mentioned right at the start, it was a lot more bright than I was expecting. However, that has kind of balanced out into a much more even sense, with a mostly tropical fruit profile feel presented in a cleaner sense as well. Day 27 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and this did backtrack ever so slightly from the previous days, as the brightness has really settled with time, as well as the sweetness being a little bit more neutral this time around, with a clear sugar sweetness that's a bit more in line with the listed pair, and I could certainly see that based off the way that it was presenting itself. A slightly marshmallow-like aspect within the finish, lending itself towards another nice experience within this coffee nonetheless. Day 30 through the V60 with a hybrid recipe, so I went 16:1 at 93, so I just went a little lower on the concentration, as I felt like the middle ground was somewhere between the recipe that we started with for this coffee, our standard recipe 16:1 at 96, and Hydrangea's recipe at a 15:1 at 93 degrees Celsius. However, this was not quite as good as the previous day, as it felt like there was just a little bit more to the coffee, and I definitely felt that way for the majority of the time that I was working with this coffee, that I could definitely get more out of it. Now, the first adjustment I would have made with this coffee had we not had Hydrangea's recipe was to go that exact direction, given that I do find the best results with Pepe's coffees to be going a little lower on the extraction, and that seems to help when we were going with Hydrangea's recipe. However, going back into the other direction of giving it a little bit more extraction didn't necessarily seem to help, as it just felt like there was much more to be had. The primary component this time around was a lingering citric quality that was a bit more reminiscent of an unripened fruit. Day 33 through the Chemex with the same hybrid recipe, and the coffee continues to feel like it's not the best it has been, as it's a bit more generic in terms of a tropical fruit experience with a light sugariness to it. So that's why for the final day on day 37, we went back to the V60 with Hydrangea's recipe, and I would say in general it's a bit yellow and lighter colored with plenty of the yellow florals, honey, and a slight bitterness in a very lingering sense with a bit of passion fruit, banana, and an overall strong tropicality. So this one definitely just seemed to skew a lot more on the tropical side of things. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have one level 5, so let's go through that one real quick, and that is the finish at a level 5. And that was really surprising to me when I was making this tasting wheel. However, I couldn't shake the fact that for whatever reason, the finish that was presented within this coffee, it just seemed to be extended and very long lasting for what it was. And as a result, I did feel the need to notate that, as it's very rare that I have coffees that had this much of a lingering, long lasting finish in a mostly, we'll say, citric as well as tropical sense, but also a little bit more of those floral components to them as well. All right. Handful of level 4s. We'll start with the cleanliness level 4. Definitely a very clean coffee, even if at times it wasn't necessarily the best and most well-defined coffee. You could definitely see that it was void of anything, including roastiness. I mentioned that I didn't experience any of that throughout the entirety of the time I was consuming this coffee. However, once again, it wasn't necessarily the latest profile out there. Sweetness level 4, and that might be one of the more interesting aspects of this coffee, because going into it I was certainly hoping that this would score very high in terms of the sweetness. However, what's kind of interesting is I went back and I looked at the tasting wheel that we made for the other Finca Soledad coffee that we had reviewed from Hydrangea, which was, interestingly enough, our last Hydrangea review, and the tasting wheels looked eerily similar, as I feel like these coffees in general, with the processing being slightly different, were also eerily similar in a number of ways, and this was no exception, as the sweetness definitely did seem to peak at that level 4 mark. And as I mentioned, I felt like I could get a lot more from this coffee, as I just didn't feel like I found the best recipe for it. But the main reason for that was because I felt the sweetness did seem to tap out at that level 4 mark. Acidity level 4, that was interestingly another characteristic of the other Finca Soledad coffee that we had had from them, as it does come out a lot more citric bright than I would have necessarily expected for a coffee like this. I've mentioned in so many Mejorado reviews that it's a little bit of a mixed bag. You don't know if you're going to get something a little bit more toned down or something that has a surprisingly higher level of brightness, so this one a bit higher in that sense. Florality level 4, that does come in two distinct manners, first of which being that honey-like aspect that is very common in a lot of Pepe's Mejorado coffees. The second being a yellow floral aspect that was also certainly quite prominent within this. I don't quite recall whether or not they had any sort of floral note listed on this coffee, but I was definitely experiencing a fair bit of that. I remember, what was it, mangosteen, stone fruit, and I think that there's pear. Yeah, those are the notes that they had listed on this coffee, if I remember correct. Berry fruit, level 4. I was definitely experiencing a little bit more of that passion fruit-like sense, and that's where the berry comes in, because I mentioned that this coffee was pretty tropical for me, and that was one of the first things that I experienced and notated within this tasting wheel itself. Citrus, level 4, and that's a couple of things. I would say that there's that interesting citric brightness, but also the listed pear. That's also kind of the best place to put it on this tasting wheel. It's the one that aligns with it the best, and that's a lot of that clear, sugary sweetness that was presented within this coffee. Stone fruit level 4, it's something that I actually didn't mention too much throughout the entirety of this tasting wheel, but I would say it was a little bit more on that sugary sense as well. So thinking a little bit more along the lines of an apricot, mango sort of stone fruit. And it also presented itself, I want to say, in a cleaner and I would say somewhat more subtle sense, as opposed to pretty direct and in your face. And then a couple level 3s, actually just one level 3, body level 3, and that's always an interesting one when it comes to Mejorados, as well, as those can be somewhere between a 2 and a 3 for the most parts. This one just seems to have a little bit more texture to it. And actually, this might be a very quick tasting wheel to discuss, because as I'm looking at it, that's kind of everything scoring 3 or higher. But I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. One of the biggest takeaways I did have from this coffee was how eerily reminiscent it was of the Probat coffees that we had had from Hydrangea in the past. As I oftentimes say that when roasters do make the transition, they lose a little bit of that specific characteristic that their coffees do have. Manhattan is a very big example of that. However, what was so interesting to me about Hydrangea is that I felt like the coffee was the same. I felt like I was drinking a Hydrangea coffee. And I don't know if that's something that's carried over for a lot of people as well, but Hydrangea does have a kind of unique quality to the coffees that they release. And this one certainly had that, and the other coffee we're going to be discussing from them also seemed to have that. So that's a massive credit to Hydrangea, as I feel like they did a very good job with the transition from the roasting machines, as these coffees were eerily similar, both of the Finca Soledad coffees that we did have. And as a result, I feel like my feelings on this one are pretty similar to that coffee. It's nice, though I definitely think that there are other iterations of Pepe's Mejorados that I've enjoyed a little bit more than this one. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I feel like it skews primarily in that more tropical as well as yellow floral scents. And that's the first place I do want to start. There is definitely a fair bit of that Mejorado-like sweetness that's presented throughout the entirety of this one. Don't get me wrong, even though it's scored at a level 4, it still is a sweeter coffee relative to the average wash processed coffee out there. In addition to that, it does offer a unique brightness that isn't necessarily always present with coffees like this, and a very lingering, long-lasting finish to kind of tie all of that together. I feel like that's the best direction to point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way to leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd definitely love to know your thoughts and impressions of this coffee, because it is kind of funny. I felt like I heard so many people buy this coffee, but then from that point, I never heard anybody actually say anything about this coffee, so I'd definitely love to know your opinions on it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Finca Soledad Pepe Wash Processed Ecuador from Hydrangea Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.